All right, so let's dive into this. You know, one of those historical turning points that just keeps sparking debate? The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, we're not here to rehash the basic facts. You already know those. But today, we're going deeper. We're using this fascinating interview with Professor Paul Post. He's a political science expert from the University of Chicago.
Right.
And he was featured on Dan Snow's History Hit podcast. And
Okay.
what he had to say, I mean, it's seriously thought-provoking. So what's our mission here? To sift through the layers of decision making, explore the motivations behind using these incredibly powerful weapons, and really just grapple with the lasting consequences. So buckle up. This is going to be intense.
Yeah, it's important to remember that in the summer of 1945, the world was holding its breath. I mean, the war in Europe was finally over. But Japan was still fighting. The U.S. was staring down the barrel of a potential land invasion of Japan, which was projected to be incredibly bloody, with hundreds of thousands of American casualties.
And amidst all that chaos, the atomic bomb emerges, not as a sudden, singular decision, but as Professor Post puts it, more like a gradual shift.
Exactly. There was no one aha moment. It was an evolution, driven by military calculations, the political climate back home, and this looming awareness of the Soviet Union's growing power on the world stage.
So let's unpack those factors. First, the military necessity argument. Was the bomb truly the only way to force Japan's surrender? Was a land invasion truly inevitable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some historians argue that Japan was already on the verge of collapse, and the bombs were overkill. Others say the invasion was unavoidable, and the bombs, horrific as they were, saved lives in the long run.
And to make things even more complicated, you've got the domestic political situation. How could Truman have justified not using this weapon? That had the potential to save American lives.
Precisely. Imagine the public outcry if he'd held back, and thousands of American soldiers died in a bloody invasion that could have been avoided. It's a chilling thought.
And then there's the Soviet Union, right? They weren't initially at war with Japan,
But the U.S. knew they were waiting in the wings, ready to pounce. The atomic bombs may have even accelerated the Soviets' decision to join the fight against Japan.
Okay. So we've got these multiple factors swirling around. Military strategy, political pressures, the Soviet wild card. It's like a pressure cooker just waiting to explode.
And in the midst of all this, there's this fascinating little side story about Kyoto, this city, with its incredible cultural and historical significance, was repeatedly removed from the target list.
Can you imagine the uproar if Kyoto had been destroyed? I mean, it
Yeah.
makes you wonder, what were they thinking? Was it purely a strategic decision? Or were there deeper ethical considerations at play? I mean, how do you balance military objectives with the preservation of cultural heritage, especially when you're dealing with a weapon of this magnitude?
It's a testament to the complexities of wartime decision-making. Even in the fog of war, there were moments of pause, of recognition that some things, some places, were simply too precious to be sacrificed.
And yet on the flip side, Professor Post argues that once the bomb was developed, its use was almost a foregone conclusion. It became a matter of when and how, not if.
It's like this dark inevitability hanging over the whole situation. Think about Oppenheimer's reaction. Relief that the bomb worked, but also this dawning horror at what he had unleashed.
It's a stark reminder that sometimes, even with the best intentions, the path we choose can lead to terrifying consequences.
Absolutely. And it forces us to ask the tough questions. Was there another way? Could the war have ended without resorting to such devastating force?
Okay, so we've set the stage. A world on edge, a weapon of unimaginable power, and a complex web of motivations swirling around the decision to use it. Now let's zero in on one of the most perplexing aspects of this whole story. The second bomb.
Just 3 days after Hiroshima, Nagasaki was hit. It begs the question, why the rush? Why not give Japan more time to consider surrender?
Exactly. Wouldn't a pause have made more sense, especially if the goal was to send a clear message about American might?
Right. That's where the debate between military procedure versus deliberate messaging comes in. If it was purely a demonstration of power, a pause would have made sense. The fact that they didn't wait suggests that there were other factors at play, perhaps even a sense of urgency that we're only beginning to understand.
So, let's bring the Soviet Union back into the picture. We know they were planning to join the war against Japan, and I mean, the timing of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria is just incredible. It happened just one day after Hiroshima. Talk about a 1-2 punch. Japan was reeling from the atomic bomb, and then suddenly they've got the Soviets marching through Manchuria.
It really makes you consider the impact this must have had on Japanese leadership. They were facing two completely unprecedented threats, each one capable of reshaping the geopolitical landscape.
It's like everything's happening at warp speed. The bomb, the invasion. It all comes down to those few chaotic days in August 1945.
And that brings us to one of the biggest debates surrounding the end of the war in the Pacific. Which event truly forced Japan's surrender? Was it the atomic bombs, or was it the Soviet invasion? Professor Post actually suggests that the Soviet invasion might have been the bigger factor.
Really? That's interesting because we know that several Japanese cities had already been devastated by conventional bombing, even more so than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Japan didn't surrender then. Why was the Soviet invasion different?
Professor Post dives into the Japanese perspective here, and it's fascinating. He suggests that the Soviet invasion presented a whole new level of threat, unpredictable, ideologically opposed to Japan's system, and potentially far more disruptive to their vision of the future. Surrendering to the U.S. might have been seen as the lesser of two evils.
It's not just about the physical destruction, it's about the potential political and ideological consequences.
Exactly. The Soviet invasion wasn't just a military attack. It was a fundamental challenge to Japan's place in the world.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. We've had two bombs, the Soviets are in the war, and then silence. No third bomb. Why?
Well, there are a couple of things to consider. First, the U.S. didn't immediately have another bomb ready. Remember, this was cutting-edge technology, not something they were mass-producing at that point.
Right, it's not like they had a whole stockpile just waiting to be used.
Exactly. But perhaps even more significantly, Truman himself stepped in and halted further bombings, at least temporarily.
Wow, so even in the midst of war, with all the pressure he was facing, Truman was able to recognize the need for restraint.
It speaks to the moral weight of the decision and the understanding that this new weapon had to be controlled, not just unleashed without any thought to the consequences.
It's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were still attempts to grapple with the ethical implications of this new kind of warfare. And speaking of ethics, let's talk about the idea of the nuclear taboo. Professor Post mentions this concept, this unspoken understanding that using nuclear weapons is simply unacceptable. He acknowledges it's not absolute. But it's undeniable that these weapons haven't been used in war since 1945.
It's a powerful testament to the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's like the world looked into the abyss of nuclear war and collectively recoiled from the horror.
But is that enough? I mean, the threat is still there, right? Nuclear weapons still exist, and countries are still vying for power on the global stage.
Absolutely. The nuclear taboo isn't a guarantee, it's more like a fragile safeguard. And as we've seen throughout history, safeguards can be broken.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive? We've covered a lot of ground here, and it's clear that this isn't a simple story with easy answers.
The decision to use the atomic bombs was a complex one, influenced by military considerations, political pressures, and the emerging Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union.
And the impact of those bombings continues to reverberate today, shaping global politics and forcing us to confront the very real threat of nuclear annihilation.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But as we've discussed, there were glimmers of hope, moments of restraint, even in the midst of such devastation. And that, perhaps, is the most important takeaway of all.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horrors, human beings are capable of choosing a different path, of seeking ways to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Yeah, it's a lot to process, that's for sure. But I think one of the things that Professor Post really hammered home is that history. It isn't just about memorizing dates and names, it's about wrestling with these huge, complex questions.
Yeah.
And trying to make sense of the choices that shape the world we live in.
Exactly. And in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those choices were incredibly difficult, with consequences that continue to ripple outward even today.
You know, Professor Post's insights, they've definitely given us a lot to ponder. But here's one final thought I want to leave you with. What if the atomic bombs hadn't been dropped on Japan? Would they have been used somewhere else? Would the world have even developed that nuclear taboo we were just talking about?
That's a question historians still grapple with. It's a what-if scenario that forces us to confront the potential for even greater devastation. The possibility that nuclear weapons could have become a more commonplace tool of war.
It's a chilling thought, but it really underscores the profound significance of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, those events weren't just about ending a war, they fundamentally changed the way we think about conflict, about the very nature of power and destruction.
And it's a legacy that demands our attention, our reflection, and our commitment to seeking a future where such horrors are never repeated.
Well, I think it's safe to say this deep dive into the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's been intense. We've explored a web of historical, political, and strategic questions, and there's certainly no easy answers here.
But that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It challenges us to think critically, to
Mhm.
question assumptions,
Yeah.
and to grapple with the complexities of the past.
And hopefully, by understanding those complexities, we can make more informed decisions in the present, working towards a future where peace prevails and the threat of nuclear war fades into a distant memory. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've surfaced with some new insights and a renewed appreciation for the power and responsibility that come with knowledge.